Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible. Joshua 12. This chapter is a summary of Israel's conquests. 1. Their conquests under Moses, on the other side Jordan, for we now suppose ourselves in Canaan, eastward, which we have the history of, Numbers 21 verse 24, etc. And here the abridgment of that history, verses 1 to 6. 2. Their conquests under Joshua, on this side Jordan, westward. 1. The country they reduced, verses 7 and 8. 2. The kings they subdued, 31 in all, verses 9 to 24. And this comes in here, not only as a conclusion of the history of the wars of Canaan, that we might at one view see what they had got, but as a preface to the history of the dividing of Canaan, that all that might be put together which they were not to make a distribution of. Summary of Israel's conquests, 1450 BC. 1. Now these are the kings of the land, which the children of Israel smote, and possessed their land on the other side Jordan toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon unto Mount Hermon, and all the plain on the east. 2. Sihon king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and ruled from Aroer, which is upon the bank of the river Arnon, and from the middle of the river, and from half Gilead, even unto the river Jabbok, which is the border of the children of Ammon. 3. And from the plain to the sea of Chinneroth on the east, and unto the sea of the plain, even the salt sea on the east, the way to Beth-Jeshemoth, and from the south, under Ashdoth Pisgah. 4. And the coast of Og king of Bashan, which was of the remnant of the giants, that dwelt at Ashtaroth and at Edrei. 5. And reigned in Mount Hermon and in Salcah, and in all Bashan, unto the border of the Jeshurites and the Maccathites, and half Gilead, the border of Sihon king of Heshbon. 6. Them did Moses the servant of the Lord and the children of Israel smite, and Moses the servant of the Lord gave it for a possession unto the Reubenites, and the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Joshua, or whoever else is the historian before he comes to sum up the new conquests Israel had made, in these verses receives their former conquests in Moses' time, under whom they became masters of the great and potent kingdoms of Sihon and Og. Note, fresh mercies must not drown the remembrance of former mercies, nor must the glory of the present instruments of good to the church be suffered to eclipse and diminish the just honor of those who have gone before them, and who were the blessings and ornaments of their day. Joshua's services and achievements are confessedly great, but let not those under Moses be overlooked and forgotten, since God was the same who wrought both, and both put together proclaim him the Alpha and Omega of Israel's great salvation. Here is 1. A description of this conquered country, the measure and bounds of it in general, verse 1 from the river Arnon in the south, to Mount Hermon in the north. In particular, here is a description of the kingdom of Sihon, verses 2 and 3, and that of Og, verses 4 and 5. Moses had described this country very particularly, Deuteronomy 2 verse 36, and chapter 3 verse 4, etc., and this description here agrees with his. King Og is said to dwell at Ashtaroth and Edrei, verse 4, probably because they were both his royal cities. He had palaces in both, and resided sometimes in one and sometimes in the other. One perhaps was his summer seat, and the other his winter seat. But Israel took both from him, and made one grave to serve him that could not be content with one palace. 2. The distribution of this country. Moses assigned it to the 2 tribes and a half, at their request, and divided it among them, verse 6, of which we had the story at large, Numbers 32. The dividing of it when it was conquered by Moses is here mentioned as an example to Joshua what he must do now that he had conquered the country on this side Jordan. Moses, in his time, gave to one part of Israel a very rich and fruitful country, but it was on the outside of Jordan. But Joshua gave to all Israel the Holy Land, the mountain of God's sanctuary, within Jordan. So the law conferred upon some few of God's spiritual Israel external temporal blessings, which were earnests of good things to come, but our Lord Jesus, the true Joshua, has provided for all the children of promise spiritual blessings the privileges of the sanctuary, and the heavenly Canaan. The triumphs and grants of the law were glorious, but those of the gospel far exceed in glory. 7. And these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel smote on this side Jordan on the west, from Baalgad in the valley of Lebanon even unto the Mount Halak, that goeth up to Seir, which Joshua gave unto the tribes of Israel for a possession according to their divisions, 8 in the mountains, and in the valleys, and in the plains, and in the springs, and in the wilderness, and in the south country, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. 9 The king of Jericho. 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel. 1. 10 The king of Jerusalem. 1. The king of Hebron. 1. 11 The king of Jarmuth. 1. The king of Lachish. 1. 12 The king of Eglon. 1. The king of Gezer. 1. 13 The king of Debir. 1. The king of Geder. 1. 14 The king of Hormah. 1. The king of Arad. 1. 15 The king of Libnah. 1. The king of Adullam. 1. 16 The king of Makkedah. 1. The king of Bethel. 1. 17 The king of Tappuah. 1. The king of Hepher. 1. 18 The king of Aphek. 1. The king of Lasharon. 1. 19 The king of Madden. 1. The king of Hazor. 1. 20 The king of Shimron Meron. 1. The king of Akshaph. 1. 21 The king of Tanakh. 1. The king of Megiddo. 1. 22 The king of Kadesh. 1. The king of Jokneam of Carmel. 1. 23 The king of Dor and the coast of Dor. 1. The king of the nations of Gilgal. 1. 24 The king of Tirzah. 1. All the kings 30 in 1. We have here abbreviate of Joshua's conquests. It lay between Jordan on the east and the Mediterranean Sea on the west, and extended from Balgad near Lebanon in the north to Halak, which lay upon the country of Edom in the south. Verse 7. The boundaries are more largely described, Numbers 34 verse 2, etc. But what is here said is enough to show that God had been as good as his word, and had given them possession of all he had promised them by Moses, if they would but have kept it. 2. The various kinds of land that were found in this country, which contributed both to its pleasantness and to its fruitfulness. Verse 8. There were mountains, not craggy and rocky and barren, which are frightful to the traveler and useless to the inhabitants, but fruitful hills, such as put forth precious things. Deuteronomy 33 verse 15, which charmed the spectator's eye and filled the owner's hand. And valleys, not mossy and boggy, but covered with corn. Psalm 65 verse 13. There were plains and springs to water them, and even in that rich land there were wildernesses too, or forests, which were not so thickly inhabited as other parts, yet had towns and houses in them, but served as foils to set off the more pleasant and fruitful countries. 3. The several nations that had been in possession of this country, Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, etc., all of them descended from Canaan, the accursed son of Ham. Gen 10:15-18. 7 nations they are called, Deuteronomy 7 verse 1, and so many are there reckoned up, but here 6 only are mentioned, the Girgashites being either lost or left out, though we find them, Genesis 10 verse 16 and Genesis 15 verse 21. Either they were incorporated with some other of these nations, or, as the tradition of the Jews is, upon the approach of Israel under Joshua they all withdrew and went into Africa, leaving their country to be possessed by Israel, with whom they saw it was to no purpose to contend, and therefore they are not named among the nations that Joshua subdued. 4. A list of the kings that were conquered and subdued by the sword of Israel, some in the field, others in their own cities, 31 in all, and very particularly named and counted, it should seem, in the order in which they were conquered, for the catalogue begins with the kings of Jericho and Ai, then takes in the king of Jerusalem and the princes of the south that were in confederacy with him, and then proceeds to those of the northern association. Now 1. This shows what a very fruitful country Canaan then was, which could support so many kingdoms, and in which so many kings chose to throng together rather than disperse themselves into other countries, which we may suppose not yet inhabited, but where, though they might find more room, they could not expect such plenty and pleasure. This was the land God spied out for Israel, and yet at this day it is one of the most barren, despicable, and unprofitable countries in the world. Such is the effect of the curse it lies under, since its possessors rejected Christ and his gospel, as was foretold by Moses, Deuteronomy 29 verse 23. 2. It shows what narrow limits men's ambition was then confined to. These kings contented themselves with the government, each of them, of one city and the towns and villages that pertained to it, and no one of them, for aught that appears, aimed to make himself master of the rest, but, when there was occasion, all united for the common safety. Yet it should seem that what was wanting in the extent of their territories was made up in the absoluteness of their power, their subjects being all their tenants and vassals, and entirely at their command. 3. It shows how good God was to Israel, in giving them victory over all these kings, and possession of all these kingdoms, and what obligations he hereby laid upon them to observe his statutes, and to keep his laws. Psalm 105 verses 44 and 45. Here were 31 kingdoms, or seigniories, to be divided among 9 tribes, and a half of Israel. Of these there fell to the lot of Judah the kingdoms of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, Eglon, Debir, Arad, Libnah, and Adullam, 8 in all, besides part of the kingdom of Jerusalem and part of Gedor. Benjamin had the kingdoms of Jericho, Ai, Jerusalem, Makkedah, Bethel, and the nations of Gilgal, 6 in all. Simeon had the kingdom of Hormah and part of Gedor. Ephraim had the kingdoms of Gezer and Tirzah. Manasseh, that half-tribe, had the kingdoms of Tappuah and Hepher, Tanakh and Megiddo. Asher had the kingdoms of Aphek and Akshaph. Zebulun had the kingdoms of Lasharon, Shimron-Meron, and Jokneam. Naphtali had the kingdoms of Maddon, Hazer, and Kadesh. And Issachar had that of Doric. These were some of the great and famous kings that God smote, for his mercy endureth forever, and gave their land for a heritage, even a heritage unto Israel his servant, for his mercy endureth forever. Psalm 136 verse 17, etc.